Every day in City Street and Country Lane, on Main Road and motorway, the buses and coaches of the National Bus Company cover hundreds of thousands of miles. Over the years, the responsibility on the bus driver has grown and grown. In nearly all towns and cities, he now has to cope not only with heavier traffic, but also with highly sophisticated vehicles. It's not surprising then that today's professional bus driver regards his job as a matter of pride. Let's take a look at driver Bailey at the wheel of his Leyland National as he performs a very ordinary shift. While you look, see if there's anything you'd do differently. The way the driver drove that bus shortened the working life of its major components. If all buses were always driven that way, their overall working lives would be reduced by a matter of years. Let me show you what I mean. Let's go back to the beginning. That chap really knew how to make a smooth gear change, didn't he? I'm sure even the passengers appreciated the smoothness of the change. The only trouble is, the gearbox hated it. You see, what happens when you change gear in a semi-automatic box is that a pneumatic piston down here pushes one of these things, called a brake band, down onto the drum inside, and off you go. It looks like this. Now, the semi-automatic is designed to require a 2-second delay between changing gears. If you make a smart racing change, what happens is that the first band doesn't have time to disengage before the second band tries to pick up. In other words, you're trying to drive the bus in 2 gears at once, which you simply can't do. So one of the brake bands will start to slip. And that will lead to this. This brake band is severely worn. Bits of the lining material have started to come away. In really severe cases, the brake band itself will actually snap. Now, it takes 6 hours to replace a gearbox. That's a day off the road at least. It doesn't take that long in a Formula 1 car, but then Jackie Stewart is paid to drive that way. Now, look at this. There's a great deal to be said for using the engine as a brake. It's a good driving practice, and drivers of all kinds of vehicles frequently use it. The only trouble is that our particular driver had let the thing go to his head. You see, by missing out a complete gear on the way down, he'd forced the engine to cope with a massive increase in revs. Keep doing that for long enough and you could end up with valves like these, or a piston like this one, or a crankshaft broken as neatly as this, or if you really went to town, you could actually do that. This unit simply couldn't take the increase in revs, and it will never run again. That will cost the operating company more than your year's wages. The answer to the problem, as all really good drivers know, is to change down at the same engine and road speeds as you change up. Mind you, if you really want to wreck the whole bus, you could always try this. Did you notice the way our driver, when he was dealing with the fares, left the bus idling in gear and was holding his position on the foot brake? By itself, of course, this is a very dangerous practice because the bus could creep forward and hit somebody. But the business of idling in gear is mechanically dangerous too. You see, it'll warm up the flywheel, and that in turn will mean that the oil inside the flywheel will get hot. Now, if that goes on for long enough, then the center seal of the flywheel in there will burst and the oil will spill out. Now, fluid flywheel oil is excellent for fluid flywheels. It's also pretty good stuff when it's hot and you let it out at catching fire. Moving off in other than the prescribed first gear isn't a particularly brilliant driving practice either. It's one of those faults that leads to the dreaded brake band slip in gearboxes, and as we've seen, that can mean a gearbox rebuild. But just as bad as being in the wrong gear is being in no gear at all, coasting. Drivers sometimes coast in neutral for the best of all possible reasons. They reckon it saves fuel. It probably does, but the trouble with this kind of well-wishing is that the cost of the fuel saved is outweighed by the mechanical problems encountered. You see, when you coast the bus, you cut off the oil supply to the gearbox here. Now, just because the bus isn't in gear doesn't mean that the gearbox bearings aren't still rotating. They are. You cut off the oil supply to a rotating bearing, and you can probably guess the rest. In time, the thing will seize up. The drivetrain as a whole is also responsible for driving the steering pump. If you coast the bus in neutral there, you'll find, in most cases, that the steering will become appreciably heavier, which too isn't a very good idea. But the biggest problem with coasting in neutral is that it denies you the opportunity of using the engine as a brake at all. You see, coasting in neutral means that the air brake compressor is only being driven at idling speed. Start using the brakes a lot under those circumstances, and you're taking out of the system more than you put into it. And when you've got no air, you've got no brakes. But assuming you haven't reached this stage and you're coasting along, then you have no engine braking effect at all. So you have to rely on your wheel brakes. Now, the more you use the brakes on the wheel, the hotter they're going to get. And there's a clear relationship between heat and braking efficiency. You see, the hotter a brake system gets, the less friction there is between the linings and the brake drum. If you look at this graph, you can see that relationship mapped out. Notice how efficiency drops off as the brakes become hotter and hotter. Of course, the more you actually use the brakes, then clearly the more frequently you're going to have to renew the linings, and changing a set of linings is a good half-day's job. But in a sense, it's the heat that's the major problem, because if brakes get very hot indeed, then this little number, the hub oil seal, can burst, which means that the hub oil will flow out over the brake linings, producing that effect. And hub oil is not known for its braking capabilities. The heat will transmit through the linings into the actual brake drum itself. It will cause the drum to expand, further reducing braking efficiency, and indeed it will produce damage to the drum surface like this. You can see it's already begun to crack up there. In a really extreme case, this can happen. This brake drum has got so hot that it's actually cracked in two. The heat will go through the brake drum and into the tyre. Here we can see an otherwise quite decent tyre which has been ruined by heat because the heat's got through into the beading. It's caused the beading to melt and to start to come away. Very dangerous indeed. And while we're on the subject of tyres, take a look at this. Both those examples of curbing can have fairly disastrous results, although we all know that there's frequently a precious little choice in using the curb as a kind of wheel marker when you pull into a stop. Nevertheless, this can affect the front wheels because they can ride the curb and fling the steering out of control with possibly catastrophic consequences. It can also produce measurable tyre damage. That type of curbing will produce damage like this, rendering an otherwise perfectly good tyre unsafe ages before the tread wears out. Here's an extreme case. The side of the tyre's actually blown through. As for clipping the curb, as we saw our hero do when he took the bus round the roundabout, this has the tendency to clip lumps out of the tyre, which produces this effect. There's a big lump out there. Now, one of these bus tyres runs at 100 pounds per square inch pressure. If you have a blowout due to curbing, that will produce major body damage to the bus and can also damage anyone unfortunate enough to be standing around at the time. And the cost of replacing just one bus tyre, 2 weeks' wages. Did you notice the classy way in which our friend put the bus effortlessly into reverse while it was still moving forward? Well, the strain on the transmission system is enormous, and the strain on his bank account will be pretty substantial too if he had to pay for the damage caused by that kind of practice. Talking of damage, I hope you noticed this, the way he actually damaged the bus by reversing it into the bus that was behind it. Damage, in fact, which the driver didn't even notice. Now, this kind of body damage can be caused through a simple inability to master the dimensions of the bus, but it can also be caused by plain stupidity. These pictures show all kinds of body damage that could have been caused by all sorts of reasons. Perhaps this chap forgot he was trying to drive a double-decker when he went under that low bridge. Lots of damage is caused by drivers trying to take shortcuts to save time, shortcuts that aren't on the route. And when you see the damage that's caused, you can see why they're not on the route. And there's a lot of damage caused, as we've seen, in depots and bus stations. All this kind of damage, which is so expensive and time-consuming to repair, could so easily have been avoided. But before we leave our bus, let's see how the driver leaves it. And as he comes through the wash there, he's left some of the windows open, which doesn't mean a thing to him, but it's going to provide a very uncomfortable ride for the passengers who sit on those seats next time it goes out. And maybe they'll feel less than favourably disposed towards their friendly neighbourhood bus company. And a final word about driver Bailey, who's driven the bus in all these extracts for us. He's asked me to say he doesn't usually drive like this. We put him up to it. But just how frequent is the kind of damage we've talked about in this film? That's the question I put to a depot engineer from the Yorkshire area, John Greaves.
The problems that we've seen in this film are problems that occur daily, either through driver error or driver not taking notice of the warning devices that are incorporated in his vehicle and not reporting the defects that do occur.
Is it possible to say what the commonest sort of problems are?
Undoubtedly, engine and gearbox failures through driver error.
And they, of course, tend to be the most expensive sort
yes,
as
they're
well.
the most expensive and the most time-consuming vehicles off the road.
Now, what kind of effect does this type of problem have on an engineering department whose job, presumably, is to keep buses running on a basis of routine maintenance?
We work to a preventive maintenance programme, which is a time-planned maintenance programme. Any fluctuation in this caused by breakdowns or failures of units holds back the preventive maintenance programme. Thereby, vehicles don't get the maintenance they should be getting, they don't get the frequency of maintenance, and invariably that causes more breakdowns, a vicious circle.
Right. Isn't it, though, something of a counsel of perfection to expect the bus driver to drive a bus through its whole working life just on regular servicing?
Yeah, it's quite true, but all that we ask is that drivers drive the vehicle with a reasonable amount of care and inform engineering of any problems they do have.
John Greaves, thank you very much indeed. Well, there we are then, the local picture from the man whose job is fixing broken buses. But what's the national scene like? That's the question I put to the National Bus Company's Director of Engineering, Peter White-Smith. How much does it cost the National Bus Company every year to keep its buses repaired and on the road?
A very considerable sum of money. Repairs for buses, in isolation from all the rest of the costs the undertaking has to bear, is about 1/5 of the total of this large sum. This could be represented in terms of fares to passengers at 2p in every 10p fare.
Now, that's tens of millions of pounds in a full year. Of those tens of millions, do you think the element represented by mechanical abuse is growing?
Yes, I think it is fair to say that it is growing, only perhaps because the bus is becoming more sophisticated.
But is it really as serious as the figures suggest? I mean, if we just look out of the window there are apparently thousands of buses. If one goes out of service, why not just put another one on?
Yes, you might say that perhaps it looks as though buses grow on trees, but they don't in fact do that. They're very expensive, complex, highly utilised pieces of equipment. The bus is scheduled throughout the whole of its life very tightly indeed, and a lot of money, in fact, goes into the process of scheduling buses very tightly. And therefore, if you've got to replace one during the day's service, the art of finding the spare bus is very considerable. And so you don't look for spare buses, or you don't look for breakdowns. And if you are faced with having to cover one, well, then everybody pulls their finger right out, so that, in fact, the cost of so doing is kept to the absolute minimum.
But how much of all this is caused by the fact that the bus, as you've suggested, is now much more sophisticated than it was some years ago? Is it really fair to expect today's driver to cope with an aircraft-style control capsule and deal with the passengers as well?
Well, it is true to say that if you looked at a bus of 20 years ago and looked at a bus today, you would find that cab ergonomics have grown and leapt forward enormously. But to answer your question quite straightforwardly, a driver has a sophisticated ticket machine, in many cases power-driven, and every other manual action he has to take in the cab is power-assisted. And in fact, one of our problems is, of course, the servicing of all these separate power sources on the vehicle, and they're very considerable.
But if today's bus is apparently much easier and more comfortable to drive, then why is the incidence of mechanical abuse growing?
Well, it's the environment, I think, in which the bus is running, and it doesn't entirely depend on the quality of the driver, although we're always looking for better and better drivers, just as we're looking for more and more passengers. It is important that we do train the driver and ask him to understand what it is he's handling. This 16-ton machine, when it's fully laden, is a very expensive, as I have already said, piece of equipment, and if it is abused in any way by the driver, well, then, of course, there is the risk that the reliability factor of the machine will go down. And this is the thing we're studying the whole time.
But in the end, does it really matter that much, either to the driver or the passenger?
Indeed it does, because we do know that if we are unreliable, that is the one big factor which turns people away from riding on buses. It is an even bigger factor than the level of fare which is charged by the bus company for people to ride, even on short journeys or long journeys, whichever it may be.
Driving a bus these days is very much a full-time job, demanding intense concentration and great professional expertise. They say that a professional takes pride in a good job well done. But remember, to earn that pride, the job has to be well done.